I never thought a worn-out wooden chair could hold the weight of my heart for over 40 years. That chair, out on the front porch, has grayed with time. The once polished arms now bear the stains of countless seasons, rain, sun, and the silent dust of forgotten conversations. People in town call it junk. Some even offered to haul it away for free. But I wouldn't trade that old chair for all the gold in Vermont. My name is Walter Greene. I'm 74 years old, and I've lived in this same house in Maple Hollow for more than 5 decades. It's the kind of small town where the mailman still knows your dog's name, and everyone waves whether they like you or not. I used to think that kind of quiet life was dull. Now it's the only thing that keeps me steady. I live alone now. My wife, Marilyn, passed 10 years ago this fall. She used to sit with me on that chair every evening, wrapped in her red knit shawl, holding a mug of chamomile tea. We didn't always talk. Sometimes we just listened, to the crickets, to the wind through the birch trees, to the silence between us that somehow said more than words ever could. After she was gone, I kept the routine. I still go out there every evening around sunset. I sit in that chair with a blanket draped across my lap and a cup of tea I never finish. Neighbors walk by and give me that look, the one people give to widowers, like sympathy wrapped in pity. But I'm not out there for them. I'm waiting. Waiting for something I can't quite name. Maybe it's peace. Maybe it's forgiveness. Maybe I'm just hoping the past might pull into the driveway, like an old friend finally finding his way home. You see, I once had a son, David. He hasn't been home in over 30 years. We used to be close, or at least I thought we were. He was smart, too smart for this little town, and bold in ways I never had the courage to be. He had dreams, big ones. Music was his world. Guitars, lyrics, vinyl records stacked like sacred texts. He talked about moving to Nashville, playing in real studios, chasing something beyond the rolling hills of Vermont. But I didn't listen. Or maybe I listened too hard to the wrong voice, my own fears, my pride, my stubborn grip on tradition. I wanted him to take over the family woodworking shop. It had been passed down 3 generations. Greene and Sons. I always imagined the Sons would finally mean something again. But David wanted more. And when he told me that, when he said he wasn't going to waste his life sanding table legs, I told him if he walked out that door, he shouldn't expect to come back. That was in the fall of 1978. Leaves were turning amber and red, like the world was on fire. I watched him throw his guitar case into the back of a rusted Chevy Nova and drive off without even looking back. I waited for a letter, a call, a sign. Nothing came. Marilyn wrote to him. I know she did. She used to sneak to the post office when she thought I wasn't paying attention. I pretended not to see. Pride is a poison that tastes like strength until it eats you alive. After she died, I found a box in the attic with some of David's old things. School drawings, a broken harmonica, and a photo of him and Marilyn fishing at Willow Creek. I stared at that picture for a long time. Then I started writing letters. Not to send, not really. Just to say what I couldn't say out loud. They're all kept in a small wooden box beneath the chair. The same chair where I told him, "You're wasting your life." The same chair where I kissed Marilyn goodnight for the last time. Sometimes I wonder what I would say if David ever came back. I've rehearsed the lines 1,000 times, each version softer than the last. But he never came. And so I sit, every evening, in that chair, waiting for the past to turn the corner, hoping that maybe, just maybe, forgiveness comes wrapped in the sound of tires on gravel. It was early October when the rain came heavy and fast, pounding the porch like it had something to prove. The kind of storm that shakes loose things you thought were nailed down, both outside and inside. I was inside that day, not feeling well. Didn't make it to the porch. When I finally stepped out the next morning, the chair was soaked, of course, but what caught my eye was the wooden box beneath it. It had fallen over. The lid had snapped loose, and the wind had scattered some of the letters across the porch like autumn leaves. I bent down slowly, my knees don't like to cooperate much these days, and started picking them up one by one. Most were fine, still dry enough to read. But the last one was different. It was the most recent letter I'd written. Just 3 days ago. The ink had run. Whole sentences blurred into smudged streaks. I could still make out pieces of it. Dear David, I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even know if you'd recognize the man I've become. And then nothing. Just water damage and regret. I sat down, letter still in hand, and let the cold creep up my spine. Funny thing about growing old, you start to feel the weight of things you thought you'd forgotten. Like guilt and longing, and the sound of your own silence echoing back at you after all these years. I realized something, sitting there with that ruined letter. I'd been waiting for David, yes, but I'd also been waiting for a moment that may never come. Waiting for the perfect apology. The right words. The right time. But life doesn't give us perfect. It gives us messy and fragile and fleeting. And sometimes it gives us one last chance, if we're lucky. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in years. I walked down to the post office with a new letter in hand. Short. Honest. No poetry, no explanations. Just this: Dear David, I miss you. Please come home. Love, Dad. I asked the clerk if the address I remembered from 30 years ago could still be found. He said he'd try. I don't know what I expected. Probably nothing. But still I waited. And waited. Until one rainy evening, I heard a car. The rain hadn't stopped for 2 days. Cold, steady, unrelenting. I was sitting in the chair again, wrapped in a wool blanket, the kind Marilyn used to drape over my shoulders when I forgot to dress for the season. I wasn't expecting anything. Not anymore. That letter I sent, it was more of a whisper than a call. A quiet surrender to whatever time I had left. Then I heard it. Tires on gravel. At first, I thought it might be a neighbor or a delivery truck turning around in the driveway. But the sound didn't fade away. It stopped. Right in front of the house. I leaned forward, peering through the rain. The windshield wipers on the black SUV were struggling against the storm. The driver sat for a moment before stepping out. A man, maybe in his 40s or 50s, wearing a dark coat and holding a wide umbrella. He stood there just looking at the house like it was both familiar and foreign. My heart did something strange. It clenched, then fluttered, then steadied itself with a nervous ache. He took a few steps forward slowly, then stopped at the edge of the porch. His face was tired, older than I remembered, but the eyes, those eyes, I'd known them since the day they opened for the first time in a hospital room in 1960. Hi, Dad, he said softly. I didn't move at first. I couldn't. Every word I'd practiced, every apology, every hug I'd imagined over 3 decades, it all disappeared in that moment. I just stared at him, soaked from the rain, standing at the threshold of a home he left as a boy and returned to as a man. He looked like he was bracing for rejection, like maybe this was a mistake and I'd send him away with the same cold words I once used to drive him off. But I stood up, slowly, carefully. My knees ached, but my heart ached more. And then I did something I hadn't done in 34 years. I hugged my son. He let out a breath, like he'd been holding it since he was 20. We didn't say much at first. Words felt too small for what that moment carried. We sat on the porch together, side by side, the old wooden chair creaking under us. I offered him the blanket. He declined. I laughed. Still stubborn, huh? He smiled. I guess I got that from you. Eventually, I asked him how he found me. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded newspaper. It was a copy of the Maple Hollow Gazette, dated 2 weeks earlier. Inside was a short article I'd written for the town's Life Stories column, a simple reflection about aging, loss, and an old wooden chair that held the weight of a lifetime. I found it online, he said. A friend forwarded it to me, said it sounded like something I'd want to read. I looked away, suddenly embarrassed. I didn't think anyone read that column. Well, he said, someone did. He reached into his backpack and handed me something. A guitar pick, worn down on the edges. I turned it over. My initials were carved into the back, W.G. I kept it, he said, even when I didn't want to think about you. I couldn't throw it away. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. I still have your harmonica. And a fishing picture. You and your mom at Willow Creek. He smiled again, softer this time. She never gave up on me. No, I whispered. She didn't. The rain began to slow. The sky, once a heavy gray, started to break open with streaks of evening gold. We sat in silence for a long while, watching the clouds drift away like old grudges finally letting go. Then I stood up, walked over to the chair, and lifted the seat. I pulled out the wooden box and handed it to him. "These are for you," I said. "Letters I wrote but never sent." I didn't know how to say I was sorry. He opened the lid, saw the folded papers inside, and didn't speak. But he didn't need to. Sometimes forgiveness isn't loud. Sometimes it's just a man holding an old box on a familiar porch, in a town where autumn comes like a hymn and fathers learn how to say, "I love you," without saying a word. David stayed. Not just for the night. Not just for the week. He stayed through October, through the bright burning leaves and the first breath of winter. He brought his guitar, his notebooks, even his stubborn rescue dog named Louie. He took the guest room, though I caught him once or twice falling asleep on the couch, the same spot where Marilyn used to knit in the afternoons. We fell into a rhythm, not unlike the one Marilyn and I once had. Morning coffee, quiet reading, evening porch talks. And always that chair. The wooden chair had started to give way under the years. A leg cracked, one of the arms was splintering. I told David I'd planned to burn it one day, maybe turn it into firewood. He looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "Let me fix it," he said. So he did. He brought out tools, would glue sandpaper. For 2 full days, he worked on that chair like it was sacred. He didn't try to make it new, he preserved the imperfections. Kept the worn seat, the notches carved by Marilyn's wedding ring, the initials W+M I once scratched in on a summer night when I had too much bourbon and too much love in my chest. "It's not about making it pretty," he said. "It's about making it strong enough to last." I think he was talking about more than the chair. One Sunday morning, I felt weaker than usual. Couldn't quite get out of bed. David brought me tea, helped me sit by the window. I could see the porch from there, see the chair waiting in its usual place. "I think I'd like to sit out there one more time," I told him. He carried me. Just like that. No hesitation. I rested in that chair, a blanket over my legs, the fall sun kissing the porch. David sat beside me with his guitar, tuning it softly. He played a song. It wasn't one I recognized, but I knew it was written for me. Slow, thoughtful, beautiful. No lyrics, just chords that felt like memories. When he finished, I placed my hand on his. "You're a good man, David. I'm proud of you. I'm sorry it took me so long to say it." He nodded, tears in his eyes. "You're a good dad," he said. "Even when you weren't." I smiled. And then I closed my eyes. I didn't feel the cold. I didn't hear the wind. I just drifted, like leaves in October, wrapped in music, memories, and the peace of being found again. The house still stands. David lives there now. Teaches guitar to neighborhood kids. Sometimes he plays on the porch, on that same wooden chair, now reinforced, polished, and treasured. When people ask him why he never left again, he smiles and says, "Because sometimes home doesn't change. You do." And every fall, when the leaves begin to turn, he plays the same song. The one he played for his father. The one that said everything words never could.